is Damon Fordham, professor of history at Virginia College in Charleston, South Carolina, and a local author and historian. Now, today I'm going to tell you about a very interesting individual in American history. A lot of people have a mistaken idea that during the days of slavery, almost all the people who had the misfortune to be slaves were completely ignorant and illiterate. Not always true, but you have to really take the time to study and read about this period to know that this was not the case, and most people don't do that. This is the story of an interesting individual, the great Robert Smalls, shown here on the cover of my book, Voices of Black South Carolina. He was born in 1839, Beaufort, South Carolina. And as a young man, he was sent to Charleston, where his master allowed him to work for some wages, provided that he give the master a portion of the wages. Eventually, he was hired by the Confederate Navy to serve, while still a slave, as the pilot for the Confederate naval ship, the Planter. And if you look very carefully at this illustration on the book, you will see the planter in the background. Now, of course, he realized that the Confederacy was not exactly fighting for his freedom, to put it mildly, so he came across an idea. One night, he gathered together his friends and relatives, put them aboard the ship, and he came across a very bold idea. He sailed the ship from the Confederate naval waters to that of the Union Army. And as they passed the sentry that was supposed to give them the signal to pass, he had his family and all of them lie down so they wouldn't be shown, and so the Confederate person for the Navy gave him the signal to pass, and they passed through to the Union Army. And when the Union Navy, and when the Union Navy happened to see the ship, Robert Smalls waved a white flag, and they saw that the ship was filled with his relatives and friends. And so thus the ship was turned over to the Union Navy, and Robert Smalls and his family were freed. Plus they were considered heroes by the North, and they were granted an audience with Abraham Lincoln and the president. However, a bounty was set up for him in the southern states. But here's something interesting. Before they set out to sail out of the Confederate naval waters, Robert Smalls filled the boat with dynamite. Why? Because had they been captured, they would have been sent back to slavery, and rather than go back to slavery, they would prefer to be blown up with dynamite. Tells you something, doesn't it? But that was not Robert Smalls' only act of greatness. You see, after the Civil War, they had what was known as the Reconstruction era. This was a brief period between 1867 and 1877, where African Americans in the South were given the right to vote, the males at least, as well as many citizenship rights. And many African Americans served with distinction in state politics during that time. Well, in January of 1868, 76 blacks and 43 whites got together in Charleston to change the Constitution of South Carolina to make it a state filled with better equality. Now, up to this time, the only people who went to school in South Carolina were wealthy white males. And of course, they were very much a minority of the state's population. And these folks would either get private tutors, or they would go to places like the University of South Carolina. However, Robert Smalls knew well that he had to get tutors to help him learn how to read, since he was born into slavery and they weren't allowed to learn to read. So what he did was he was a delegate to this convention. And on January the 23rd, 1868, according to the records of that convention, Robert Smalls said these words in South Carolina: resolved that for the purpose of making effective the common school system, it be required that all parents and guardians send their children between the ages of 7 and 14 to some school at least 6 months for each year, under penalties for non-compliance to be fixed by law. That was the first law that made it mandatory for poor and rich, male and female, black and white students to receive an education in South Carolina. And the public school system today is one of the greatest testaments of Robert Small's legacies. And in fact, there's a middle school that used to be a high school in Beaufort, South Carolina that is very fittingly named after Robert Smalls. Read more about it in my book, Voices of Black South Carolina. This is Damon Fordham.